It was the kind of Portland night that swallowed sound. The rain didn't fall, it whispered. It traced the edges of ivy on brick, wove through the skeletal trees, and slid down the stone gargoyles perched above the university courtyard. Beneath that persistent drizzle, the lights of Willamette University glowed a faint amber, haloed by mist. It was October 18, 1967, and the city was about to bury another secret. Evelyn Marks left the library a few minutes after 10. She carried 2 books pressed tightly against her chest, one on Renaissance poetry, another on forensic linguistics. She was bright, ambitious, and, as her professors liked to say, a little too fearless for her own good. Her dark hair clung to her cheeks as she stepped out into the rain, but she didn't quicken her pace. The wind nipped, and the lampposts hummed faintly. Behind her, the library lights blinked once before dimming. Across the quad, a figure stood beneath an umbrella, Professor Harold Whitmore. His silhouette was unmistakable, tall, angular, and always impeccably dressed. Whitmore was known across campus as the liberal arts department's rising star, a scholar of language and history, a man who quoted Auden and Eliot as if they were kin. To his students, he was inspiring. To his colleagues, he was intimidating. No one really knew him beyond the walls of his lectures, and few dared to ask. That evening, Whitmore had stayed late, marking essays in his office as the storm gathered. He claimed he enjoyed the solitude. In truth, it was the silence he craved, the kind that came when the rest of campus had gone home. As he looked out through his office window, he noticed Evelyn walking beneath the arches, coat collar turned up against the cold. She waved politely when she saw him, a brief flicker of recognition through the fog. Whitmore lifted his hand in return, though his eyes lingered on her longer than courtesy required. Minutes later, a janitor spotted Evelyn crossing the basketball courts, her step slow, unhurried. After that, no one ever saw her again. By morning, her roommate Janet Sinclair was pacing the dormitory hallway, her voice cracking as she told the night guard that Evelyn hadn't returned. Janet was the cautious type, the kind who always reminded Evelyn to text before heading home. "She's probably still at the library," the guard said, half asleep at his desk. But Janet knew better. Evelyn's studies were her world, but she was punctual to a fault. Something was wrong. At dawn, Portland police officers gathered in front of the administration building. Detective Frank Bowen, a man with a tired face and too many unsolved cases under his belt, took charge of the search. "A girl doesn't vanish on her own in this weather," he muttered. Volunteers combed the lawn, their flashlights winking between the trees. The Willamette River ran close to campus, dark and swollen from the rain. Officers moved toward the banks, their boots sinking into the mud. It was a groundskeeper who made the first discovery, a scarf, blue and soaked through, tangled in a bush near the path to the old science building. Beside it, faint footprints led toward the river, but stopped at a patch of churned mud, erased by the storm. Inside the language department, Whitmore watched from his office window as police cars gathered. His expression betrayed nothing. When detectives came by to ask faculty if they'd seen Evelyn, Whitmore's account was calm and precise. "Yes," he said. "She left the library a little after 10. We exchanged a wave. She seemed in good spirits." Bowen thanked him and noted how steady the man seemed. "Too steady. You must have been one of the last to see her," the detective said. Whitmore nodded and offered coffee, his tone measured, almost sympathetic. Days stretched into weeks. The search expanded beyond campus. Missing posters bloomed across cafe windows and bus stops. The university held vigils. Professors spoke gravely about safety. But as November rolled in, rain replaced hope. Without evidence, the investigation stalled. Evelyn Marks became one more ghost in Portland's endless drizzle. Still, not everyone stopped looking. Janet Sinclair refused to move on. She combed through Evelyn's dorm room, hoping for something, a clue, a letter, a secret connection. That's when she found the card. It was tucked inside one of Evelyn's books, an invitation embossed with elegant calligraphy. Private Symposium, Department of Linguistics, Faculty Lounge, October 18, 1967. Speaker, Professor Harold Whitmore. The event was never announced publicly. Janet's stomach turned. When she brought the card to campus police, they brushed it off. Probably just an internal meeting, one officer said. But Detective Bowen listened. He checked records. There was no documentation of any symposium that night. And Whitmore's colleagues couldn't recall any scheduled event in his department either. Bowen returned to Whitmore's office 3 days later. Books lined every wall, ancient volumes on philology, illuminated manuscripts, Greek etymology. Whitmore looked up from his desk, smiling thinly. "Detective Bowen, I trust you've made progress." "Maybe," Bowen answered. "Funny thing, we can't find any record of that symposium you hosted the night Evelyn disappeared." Whitmore leaned back. "Ah, that was an informal roundtable. A few colleagues from Reed and Lewis and Clark. Nothing official." His tone was unbothered, but Bowen noted how the professor's gaze drifted to the rain-spattered window. "And you'd have a list of attendees?" "I didn't take attendance, Detective. It wasn't that sort of gathering." Bowen left unconvinced. Something about the man's composure grated on him. Usually, people fidgeted under inquiry. But Whitmore, he moved like someone rehearsing lines he'd written himself. When Christmas arrived, the case was cold. News headlines faded. Parents stopped calling. Students whispered theories. Some said Evelyn ran away. Others claimed she was taken by a stranger. The administration urged everyone to focus on healing. Whitmore continued teaching, his reputation untouched, his lectures drawing even larger crowds. To outsiders, he was a man of intellect and tragedy, widowed, devoted, dignified. To Janet Sinclair, he was something else entirely. She began following him quietly, discreetly, sitting in on his lectures, noting his routines. Every Wednesday, he visited a small cabin on the city's outskirts, said to be his retreat for writing. One snowy morning, Janet drove there. The cabin was small, hidden behind fir trees. Through the window, she saw Whitmore at his desk, typewriter clacking. She stepped closer, and her heart froze. On the wall, behind him, hung a photograph. It was Evelyn, smiling, unposed, the kind of photo only someone close would have. Janet backed away, trembling. That was the moment she realized she wasn't dealing with grief, but with guilt. She returned to campus terrified, torn between telling the police or staying silent. Who would believe her? A sophomore accusing one of the most respected professors in Oregon? By the end of winter break, she'd made her decision. The next chapter of Portland's forgotten tragedy was about to begin. The wind hit the cabin first, a sharp, whistling hum that rattled the loose boards and cut through the evergreens. It was early January 1968, and snow blanketed the outskirts of Portland, muffling every sound except the faint crackle of a fire and the steady clack of a typewriter inside. Professor Harold Whitmore sat hunched at his desk, his fingers moving rhythmically, composing an essay for a literary journal he claimed to admire. But his mind wasn't on form or theory. It was elsewhere, deeper, somewhere he couldn't afford anyone to find. Whitmore's cabin was a relic of solitude, a single room lined with books, its walls yellowed by age. To visitors, it looked like a retreat for a scholar, modest but dignified. To those who might have stayed longer than a polite afternoon, it carried something unsettling in the air, an odor of damp wood and something faintly chemical. No one ever asked about it, because no one ever came that close. A few miles away, Janet Sinclair parked her aging Ford behind a cluster of firs. Her hands shook as she held the camera on her lap. She had borrowed it from the photography lab, told the assistant she needed it for a journalism project. What she planned was reckless, she knew that, but after what she saw the week before, she couldn't sleep. The image of Evelyn's smiling face, framed perfectly on Whitmore's wall, haunted every breath she took. She waited until dusk before stepping out, her boots crunching the snow. Through the fogged windows, she could see Whitmore moving about, reading, sipping tea, returning to his typewriter. At one point, he rose and walked toward the small basement door behind his writing desk. Janet clicked the camera's lens into focus, heart pounding. The professor paused mid-step, as if he sensed something. Then, with a deliberate calm, he disappeared down the stairs. When he didn't return for 10 minutes, Janet crept closer. There was something magnetic about the quiet, an almost physical pull drawing her toward the window. She wiped the condensation with her sleeve and peered inside again. The basement door stood ajar, now, a dull light flickering below. She could hear the faint hum of machinery, maybe a heater, maybe something else. Then, just as the air thickened with dread, headlights swept through the trees. Janet dropped to the ground, heart hammering. Two men stepped out of a dark vehicle. Their coats bore the emblem of the Portland Police Department. Detective Bowen led the way, flashlight in hand. He'd spent Christmas thinking of the case, unable to let it rest. When Janet finally called his office and told him what she'd seen, he didn't hesitate. "If you're right," he'd said, "this man's been hiding in plain sight for months." Bowen knocked hard. No answer. The detective motioned to his partner, then turned the knob. It wasn't locked. Inside, the cabin was warmer than expected. Papers, books, and teacups cluttered every surface. A manual typewriter sat mid-page, its ribbon taut with half-typed words. "Truth is not about discovery, but control." Bowen frowned. "Professor Whitmore?" Silence. They descended the basement steps slowly. The basement walls were lined with shelves of old journals and boxes sealed with twine. But what caught Bowen's eye wasn't the clutter. It was the curtain that divided the room. He pulled it aside. Behind it lay a single wooden table draped in a stained sheet. A faint smell of formaldehyde lingered. Next to it stood a camera tripod and photo enlarger. Bowen's flashlight beam slid across a glass jar. Inside, a gold bracelet glimmered faintly under liquid. Evelyn's initials were etched into the clasp. "Jesus," Bowen muttered, stepping back. Whitmore emerged from the shadows at the far end of the basement, hands raised slightly, expression blank. "Detective Bowen," he said quietly, voice echoing. "Breaking into a man's private space without a warrant. I expected better." "You should expect worse," Bowen snapped. "Where's the girl, Harold?" Whitmore smiled faintly, as if he'd heard an amusing line from a play. "You think there's still a girl to find?" Within minutes, the cabin filled with noise, radios crackling, boots on wood, the shuffle of evidence bags. Whitmore was let out into the snow, his face calm, almost serene. Janet, standing among the trees, watched in stunned silence. She expected him to protest, to deny everything. But he didn't say a word. Not when they cuffed him. Not when Bowen read his rights. Not even when they found the rest, photographs, diaries, and a lock of brown hair sealed in an envelope marked EM. The story broke overnight. Willamette professor arrested in student's disappearance. Newspapers across Oregon printed his face alongside Evelyn's. The university board moved swiftly, stripping Whitmore of his tenure and suspending him indefinitely. The faculty were stunned. Students protested on the courthouse steps, demanding justice. The intellectual, who had once embodied dignity, now stood accused of murder. In his first interrogation, Whitmore told police very little. He didn't deny owning the objects in the basement, but insisted they were academic curiosities. The photographs, he claimed, were part of an art project exploring identity. The jewelry, he said, must have been planted. Bowen listened, stone-faced. But when he slid the photographs across the table, pictures of Evelyn in candid moments on campus, at the library, even outside her dorm, Whitmore's hands trembled for the first time. "Where did you take these?" Bowen demanded. "I didn't take them," Whitmore replied softly. "I kept them." "You stalker." "She was extraordinary," Whitmore murmured. "I wanted to understand her mind." By dawn, he confessed to nothing but admiration. Her disappearance was tragic, he claimed, but not of my doing. Still, the evidence mounted. Blood traces in the basement, fibers matching Evelyn's coat. Diary entries in Whitmore's messy script describing experiments in human character. Prosecutors pushed for a full charge. Then, before the trial could begin, everything shifted. On February 9, 1968, a fisherman on the Willamette River reported something caught beneath the old rail bridge. Police divers pulled a body from the current, preserved by the cold. Dental records confirmed what Portland had feared. Evelyn Marks had been found. But the autopsy brought confusion. Time of death placed her demise more than a week after her disappearance. Someone had kept her alive. The revelation rocked the investigation. And quietly, hauntingly, Whitmore began to smile again. In the courtroom of public opinion, he was already guilty. But the discovery of Evelyn's body, and the timeline it suggested, opened a new, chilling possibility. Had someone else been involved? The arrest had solved the mystery for the city, but Bowen felt a growing unease. There was something in Whitmore's eyes that said the story wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. And he was right. By early spring of 1968, the case of Professor Harold Whitmore versus the state of Oregon had become a national fixation. Journalists flooded Portland from every major paper west of the Mississippi. Television reporters camped outside the courthouse, their microphones fogging in the chill air, waiting for a glimpse of the man whose brilliance had decayed into infamy. Whitmore, pale behind his round glasses, appeared at every hearing in a dark suit and gray tie. His calm, not remorseful, not defiant, just eerily measured, unnerved even the most hardened observers. Detective Frank Bowen had seen murderers show shame, rage, denial, but not this. Whitmore acted as though he were grading an exam rather than standing trial for the death of a 20-year-old student. Even when confronted with photographs taken inside his cabin, he spoke with detachment, explaining each item like an anthropologist describing an artifact. The bracelet? A keepsake left behind after a tutorial. The blood traces? A contamination from hunting trips past. Every answer balanced between intellect and insanity, enough to make the courtroom doubt its own footing. The prosecution relied on evidence, blood-type matches, fiber samples, handwritten notes describing psychological reconstruction of a young woman. The defense countered each point with grace and precision. Whitmore's attorney, a sharp-tongued man named Leonard Cairn, painted his client as a misunderstood scholar, the victim of a sensationalist witch hunt. In a climate of moral panic, Cairn declared, everyone seeks a monster. Sometimes they build one where there was none. Janet Sinclair sat through every session. She didn't believe in monsters, but she believed in patterns. The more she listened, the more she sensed that Whitmore's control over the narrative wasn't resistance. It was theater. He wasn't fighting for his life. He was orchestrating the story. It was his final lecture, and the courtroom was his stage. During recess one afternoon, Bowen found Janet in the hallway, her hand wrapped around a coffee cup gone cold. "You shouldn't keep coming here," he said softly. "He sees you. Every time he enters, the first thing he looks at is where you're sitting." Janet nodded, voice low. "I know. That's why I do it. If I'm here, he knows he can't bury her twice." Bowen studied her face, pale, exhausted, yet resolute. "Has anyone threatened you?" "Only the silence," she said, then turned away. The trial stretched into the early months of summer. Witness after witness testified, students, janitors, colleagues. A librarian recalled seeing Evelyn arguing with Whitmore the week before she vanished. A local store owner claimed he'd sold chemicals to the professor used for preservation work. Each detail tightened the noose, yet something about the pattern felt deliberate, almost too neat. Then came the moment that tipped the courtroom. The prosecution introduced a newly discovered tape, a reel-to-reel recording recovered from Whitmore's cabin. Its crackling voice, faint but undeniable, carried Evelyn's tone. Fragments of conversation were audible. She was reading poetry aloud, Whitmore's voice occasionally interrupting, whispering corrections or praise. At one point she said, "Why are you recording this?" The recording ended there, abruptly, as if someone had turned off the machine mid-answer. The courtroom held its breath. Jurors exchanged glances. Whitmore remained still. That evening, Portland's newspapers printed bold headlines. Audio links professor to victim hours before disappearance. Public outrage erupted. Outside the courthouse, students lit candles in memory of Evelyn Marks. The university board released a statement expressing deep sorrow and cooperation with law enforcement. Behind closed doors, however, faculty members were divided. Some believed Whitmore guilty beyond doubt. Others defended his intellectual legacy, insisting that brilliance too often walks the edge of madness. Whitmore's reaction to the recording came not in words, but in a faint curling of the lips, half amusement, half pity. "Truth," he said to Bowen during a recess, "isn't revealed, detective. It's constructed. You're building yours beautifully." Bowen stared at him, jaw tight. "You built yours over a grave." Whitmore smiled again. "Every academic does, in one way or another." When the jury retired for deliberation, the entire city froze in anticipation. Hours stretched into a full day. Bowen sat outside the courtroom with Janet, who refused to leave. She clutched Evelyn's scarf, the one recovered from the bush near the science building. It smelled faintly of dust now, but holding it made her feel less alone. At 6:15 p.m., the bailiff announced the jury's return. The foreman, an elderly man with trembling hands, handed the verdict slip to the judge. The room fell silent. On the charge of murder in the first degree, the judge read aloud, "We find the defendant not guilty." The words landed like a blow. Gasps filled the chamber. Bowen sat motionless, unable to breathe for a moment. Janet's hand crushed the fabric of the scarf until her knuckles whitened. Whitmore exhaled once, slow and deliberate, then turned toward the gallery. His eyes met Janet's, and for a moment there was something like gratitude in them. Gratitude or mockery. Outside, flashbulbs exploded as he exited the courthouse. "Professor, how does it feel to be a free man?" reporters shouted. Whitmore smiled faintly and said only, "The pursuit of truth never ends." Then he disappeared into a waiting car, leaving Portland stunned. The public erupted in fury. Protests broke out on campus. Students smashed faculty office windows. Evelyn's parents fled the city, unable to bear the attention. The district attorney issued a statement promising to appeal, but with the available evidence, there was little chance. The verdict stood. For Bowen, it wasn't closure, but corrosion. He spent nights revisiting the details, the inconsistencies, the overlooked threads. The timeline of Evelyn's final week still refused to make sense. If Whitmore had kept her alive for days, what had he done during that time? And why had he let her body surface only after his arrest? Then, in late June, just as Portland began to settle back into uneasy routine, a letter arrived at Bowen's desk. It bore no return address, only the word continuing written in elegant script. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, taken through glass. It showed Whitmore in a study that wasn't his cabin. Behind him, pinned to the wall, was another photograph, Janet Sinclair. Bowen's hand trembled as he looked closer. There was a note written beneath the image. She was extraordinary too. Portland's rain seemed colder that July. It ran down police car windshields and turned gutters into rivers, washing away weeks of protest banners that still clung to the curbs. The city wanted closure, but closure would not come. Professor Harold Whitmore had been declared a free man, not innocent perhaps, but free, and yet there was no peace. For Detective Frank Bowen, the photograph that arrived without return address gnawed at his thoughts night and day. It wasn't just the image of Whitmore's new study or the photograph of Janet pinned behind him. It was the handwriting, elegant, precise, distinctly his. Every loop and curve screamed the professor's voice, as though the man had reached across a barrier just to whisper that the story wasn't done. Bowen reopened the files. Officially, the department had closed the Marks case after the verdict, but unofficially, nobody had told him to stop. He spent each evening at his desk, replaying the audio tape, matching every pause and breath. "Truth is not discovery," he'd once quoted, "it's control." That sentence wasn't only on Whitmore's typewriter. It was carved into his entire world. Meanwhile, Janet Sinclair tried to disappear. After the trial, she left Willamette University and took a job at a newspaper on the east side of town, working in copy editing, far from campus, far from memories. But the past had a way of following her. 2 weeks after the verdict, a letter arrived at her apartment. There was no name, no address, just a single sentence typed neatly across cheap stationery. "We are always students of what we fear." There was no signature, but the return stamp showed Portland's Central Post Office, mailed the day after Whitmore's release. She sat on the edge of her bed for nearly an hour, staring at the line until the words blurred. Then she tore it in half, only to stop when she noticed something faintly embossed in the paper. The watermark of Willamette University. The kind used only in faculty correspondence. By morning, she was standing inside Bowen's office, holding the letter in a plastic sleeve. "He's writing me," she said, her voice barely steady. Bowen examined it. Typed on a Remington model, ribbon slightly dry. Same machine he used in his cabin. "You think it's him?" "I'd bet my badge." He filed it into an envelope and sighed. "This man doesn't just murder people, Janet. He studies them. You said it yourself. The trial was theater. Maybe this is the encore." Days turned into weeks. 2 more letters arrived. Each bore a phrase, cryptic but deliberate. "We become the ones we observe." "Do you remember the library steps?" Neither contained threats, but both carried a weight of knowing. Details that only Evelyn's killer could possess. Bowen traced every typewriter sale in the region, every ribbon refill, every faculty contact. Nothing. It was as if Whitmore had evaporated. No address, no employment records, no known residence. The man who once lectured to packed halls had vanished into the gray Oregon mist. Then, in late August, a janitor at the Old Language building discovered something sealed behind a false panel in Whitmore's former office, a small wooden box, wrapped in parchment. Inside were 2 objects, a leather-bound notebook filled with coded passages, and a photograph dated October 1967. The image showed Whitmore standing beside 2 men in an unfamiliar room, perhaps a study group or private gathering. In the far corner, partially cropped, a face could be seen, Evelyn Marks, looking uncomfortable, eyes slightly turned away from the camera. Bowen examined the notebook. The words were handwritten in a cipher based on linguistic transpositions, something only a scholar like Whitmore could devise. After days of work, a pattern began to emerge. The passages described sessions, with participants identified only by initials, EM, JS, and 3 others. The text spoke of docility, pattern learning, and memory as experiment. It sounded less like teaching and more like manipulation. And there, halfway through, a chilling entry. EM has resisted the final phase. I may have overestimated her compliance. Tonight must determine outcome. Bowen couldn't breathe for a moment after reading it. He closed the notebook slowly. He didn't just want obedience, he whispered. He wanted transformation. Janet, sitting across the table, stared into the dim light of the police archives. "What does that mean?" "It means you weren't his first choice," Bowen said softly. "But you might be his last." The phrase lingered. Over the next weeks, she lived looking over her shoulder. Neighbor shadows looked too long, footsteps behind her too familiar. Sometimes she thought she saw him on the opposite corner, a tall figure in a trench coat, umbrella angled low. But Portland was full of those in the rain, and every time she blinked, he was gone. One night in September, as the rain thickened and the air turned to fog, Janet returned home to find her door unlocked. Inside, nothing was taken, nothing disturbed. Except on her table, beneath her lamp, lay another letter. This one handwritten, neat and graceful. "Janet, you understood what the others couldn't. You saw beyond fear. That is why I chose not to finish your story that night by the cabin. You belong to the inquiry as much as I do. There is no teacher without the student. H.W." She took it straight to Bowen. He didn't speak for a full minute after reading it. Then he said, "He's here. Watching you. Testing how far you'll go before you break." Janet clenched her fists. "Then let's give him something to watch." Under Bowen's guidance, they set up surveillance, officers disguised as tenants, phone lines tapped, mail tracked. Weeks passed. Nothing. No sighting, no new letters. The trail froze again, mocked by silence. But on an ordinary gray morning, Bowen received a call that shattered it wide open. A storage facility downtown, one leased under a false name since 1968, had flooded after heavy rain. Inside the damaged unit, workers found boxes labeled Research Archive, property of H. Whitmore. The facility owner recognized the name immediately. Within hours, Bowen and his team descended into the musty basement of the building. The stench of mildew mixed with old paper. Dozens of boxes lined the walls, some bursting from moisture, others sealed with wax. Inside were notebooks, photographs, tape reels, even film canisters labeled with dates. Each marked a name, followed by Session I, Session 2, and so on. Evelyn's initials appeared on 3 tapes. Janet's appeared on 1. Bowen glanced at her across the room. "You ever record anything with him?" She shook her head. "Never." He loaded one of the reels onto the player. The machine clicked, coughed, then began to spin. The voice that filled the small space was faint but unmistakable. Harold Whitmore, calm and cold, instructing someone to remember the lesson. Then a woman's trembling voice answered, one that wasn't Evelyn's nor Janet's. It was someone they hadn't yet identified. As the tape hissed to silence, Bowen muttered, "There were more than 2. What neither of them knew was that far from a city on the Oregon coast, a gray house with shuttered windows stood quiet. Inside, the faint sound of a typewriter echoed through the salt-heavy air. Professor Harold Whitmore was writing again, each keystroke deliberate, almost tender. And his latest manuscript began with a familiar sentence. Portland, Oregon, 1967. A young woman vanishes in the rain. Autumn returned with a vengeance, sweeping dead leaves into university courtyards and flooding Portland's sewers with brown torrents. Students hurried through crosswalks, heads ducked beneath umbrellas, their world reshaped by caution. The specter of the Evelyn Marks case lingered in every shadow, yet the city seemed resigned to ambiguity. Detective Bowen was not. The evidence from Whitmore's archive transformed the investigation. What began as a murder case now revealed itself as something deeper. A constellation of manipulations and secrets, concealed for years by faculty loyalty and institutional pride. Each tape and notebook cracked open another facet of Whitmore's intellectual circle, a network that extended far beyond Willamette University. Bowen worked with his small team in secret, parsing out names and cross-referencing archives. The initials marked in Whitmore's notebooks matched registries from local colleges, scholarly societies, and closed-door faculty meetings dating back a decade. Among the sessions were references not only to Evelyn and Janet, but to 3 other individuals, TR, SH, and KL. Each was described in chilling terms: obedience, resistance, transformation. The language, though clinical, betrayed a pattern. Meetings masquerading as tutorials, covert psychological experiments, a blurred line between study and control. Janet Sinclair, back in Bowen's office, thumbed through old yearbooks and faculty photos. She recognized SH Susan Harper, a graduate student who vanished briefly in 1966, later returning and refusing to speak of her absence. TR Thomas Riley, expelled for ethical violations after a private confrontation with Whitmore. KL Karen Liu, who left a promising career, moving to Canada with no explanation. Each, it seemed, had become entangled in Whitmore's web. Bowen decided to visit Harper first. She lived alone in a house adorned with antique locks in a suburb west of the city. Facing Bowen at her kitchen table, Susan's eyes betrayed years of broken sleep. "He made you believe you owed him everything," she whispered. "One day you wake up and nothing in your life is yours. Not even the words in your head." "He kept records," Bowen said gently. "Not just about Evelyn, but you too. Can you tell me anything he did, anything that connects to her case?" Susan hesitated, then nodded. "During one session, he asked me to watch the quad from his office window. He said observation was the key to understanding motive. I thought it was academic until I saw him shadowing Evelyn, scribbling notes every time she stopped to greet someone, every time she lingered at a bench. It was as if he was charting her humanity." Bowen left Harper's house shaken. Whitmore's research had bled into manipulation, into the mechanical snuffing of autonomy in brilliant minds. Evelyn, it seemed, had challenged him and paid dearly. Janet reached out to Thomas Riley, tracking him through a faded address in the Northwest Industrial District. He answered warily, refusing at first to let her into his cramped apartment. When she explained who she was, he relented, voice tight, hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. He tested limits, Riley confessed. Which fears could break you, which could bend you? Harper cracked, but I threatened to expose him. He found a way to get me expelled instead. What about Evelyn? Janet pressed. He told me she was the ideal subject. Too self-assured. He wanted to prove that no one was immune to influence. The last time I saw her, she was crying outside the science building, saying she felt studied. Nobody listened. With each interview, the picture sharpened. Whitmore had curated disciples, molding them with praise, isolating them with criticism, then dissecting their emotional reactions. In Evelyn, he encountered resistance, defiance, the refusal to bend. That was likely why she became the final experiment. Bowen compiled these testimonies, drawing diagrams on his office wall. At the center was Whitmore, radiating connections like a spider in the web. Disciples circled him, marked not by loyalty, but by trauma. What troubled Bowen most, though, was a single line in one of Whitmore's notebooks. Descent into the subjective self reveals best tested when the observer loses autonomy. Were Evelyn's final days a psychological unraveling, engineered by her own mentor? Janet, now more determined than ever, returned to the cabin with Bowen. They spent hours beneath the warped roof, digging through storage, uncovering another photograph. Whitmore with 3 young women at a faculty dinner, 2 smiling, 1 looking away. Beneath the image was a handwritten label. Final study, completion. The timestamp matched the night of Evelyn's disappearance. What was completed? Janet asked, voice unsteady. Bowen shook his head. I don't know. But it wasn't justice. They sent the image to the university board. The response was rapid. A rare emergency meeting convened. Faculty suspended. The president pressured to resign. Alumni threatened to withdraw donations. Students organized new protests. A fever of reckoning swept the campus. Yet Whitmore himself was nowhere to be found. In late October, a breakthrough arrived. Karen Liu, tracked to Vancouver, sent Bowen a letter after learning he'd reopened the files. She described a ritual Whitmore enacted for each member of his circle, a series of staged ethical dilemmas meant to erode identity. He embedded your worst fear into something ordinary, Liu wrote. For me, it was taking credit for someone else's work. For Evelyn, it was being forced to watch herself denigrate friends. He always filmed, always recorded, always made it feel unfairly intimate. Bowen and Janet pieced together every name, every session, every story. A pattern of psychological domination emerged, culminating with Evelyn, who, records revealed, had received dozens of anonymous notes in her dorm before vanishing. The final note arrived the night she disappeared. Tonight, truth will be tested. They turned everything over to the police and the university, triggering a formal investigation into faculty conduct spanning years. The city had demanded answers and now received them, not only about Evelyn, but about dozens of lost, frightened students churned through Whitmore's circle. But the story was not done. Bowen, Janet, and Harper, all former students, all survivors, grappled with their new reality. They were no longer just witnesses, but evidence, each carrying scars from the professor who made truth a weapon. And somewhere along the Oregon coast, as October winds battered gray windows, a man once revered watched the fury unfold, pen poised above an empty page. Whitmore would tell his own story, too, unabsolved, unrepentant, preparing for one final act. Portland's truth, on the edge of winter, was colder than ever before. By November, winter had crept into Portland's bones. Rain turned to sleet, and the Willamette campus lay drenched in gray, its courtyards almost silent, students rushing between classes with heads bowed against the wind. The banners from the protests had been torn down, but the university was still raw. Everyone felt the ghost of Evelyn Marks, as real as the rain on their coats. The library steps, once bustling, now seemed to whisper her name with every gust of wind. Detective Frank Bowen drove through the empty streets leading to campus one late afternoon, headlights cutting across the drizzle. The investigation into the Whitmore Circle had grown into a full federal inquiry, uncovering a string of unethical psychological studies buried under layers of academic jargon and deleted correspondence. Professors had stepped down. Students had come forward, trembling but resolute. And yet, beyond the public fallout, Bowen couldn't ignore the simplest truth. Harold Whitmore was still at large. He parked near the English department, staring at the old building that had seen lectures, debates, and quiet manipulation behind closed doors. The lights inside flickered weakly. For a moment, Bowen let the radio news play, updates on the inquiry, the memorial scholarship being created in Evelyn's name. Then the announcer mentioned something unexpected. Willamette University was reopening the old linguistic archives to the public as part of its commitment to transparency. Bowen frowned and turned off the engine. The archives, Whitmore's old domain. Inside, the corridors smelled of paper and dust. Boxes were stacked along the walls, labeled hastily in permanent marker. A custodian guided him to the basement, where the old files had been stored before the scandal broke. "You're not the only one poking around," the man mumbled. "Some lady from the press was here earlier. Said she was working with the detective on the case." Bowen's stomach sank. "Red hair? Glasses?" The custodian nodded. "Yeah, that's her. She left an hour ago. Said she found something she needed." Janet Sinclair. Bowen hurried down the stairwell, 2 at a time. The basement door was ajar, and a cold draft cut through. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above rows of cabinets. A half-open box lay on the floor, spilling papers across concrete, typed letters, lecture notes, photographs. He recognized Whitmore's handwriting instantly. On the top lay a letter addressed simply, J.S. Completion. He barely had time to process it when he heard footsteps echoing down the corridor. "Janet," he called. No answer. A shadow flickered past one of the shelves, swift, deliberate. Bowen drew his flashlight and moved quietly. "Janet, talk to me." A faint voice came from deeper inside. "I'm here." He followed the sound to the far end of the archives, where a small reading lamp glowed faintly atop a table. Janet sat there, pale and tense, a folder open before her. On the page were photographs, grainy black and white images of students in conversation. "He filmed everything," she whispered. "Every meeting, every interview. Even when he pretended to teach, he was directing." Bowen stepped closer. "We'll take this to evidence tomorrow." But she didn't move. Instead, she stared at the corner of the room, where an old film projector stood, loaded and ready. "He left this playing when I got here," she said quietly. Bowen's jaw tightened. "What's on it?" Without waiting for an answer, she flipped the switch. The projector whirred to life, casting flickering light on the wall. Through the grainy frame, Evelyn Marks appeared, smiling nervously, sitting by the window of a classroom. Off camera, Whitmore's voice filled the silence. Calm, deliberate. "Evelyn," he said, "do you trust me?" Evelyn hesitated. Then, softly, "I think I do." The screen crackled. The recording ended. The silence between Bowen and Janet thickened. "He still has copies," Bowen whispered, his mind racing. "He wanted you to see this." Janet turned toward him. "No, he wanted you to." Before Bowen could respond, a sound from upstairs shattered the quiet. A door creaking open, slow as breath. They froze. Footsteps echoed down the stairwell, deliberate and measured, not in panic, but in rhythm. Bowen grabbed his flashlight and drew his weapon. "Stay here," he ordered, though his voice betrayed a tremor. The figure that emerged from the shadows wore a long coat, collar turned high. Time had altered his face, thinner, sharper, but the eyes were unmistakable. Whitmore stepped into the light, like a memory turned solid. "Detective," he said mildly. "Late as always. I thought you might come sooner." Bowen raised his weapon, jaw clenched. "It's over, Whitmore." Whitmore smiled faintly. "Nothing ends when men like you say it does. That's the problem with law enforcement. You believe truth has borders." Janet rose from her chair, fury overtaking fear. "You wrote to me. You watched me. Why? Why, Evelyn?" Whitmore's gaze softened with something almost like sorrow. She stopped learning. She wanted to understand me, but refused to look inward. "You, Miss Sinclair, you did. You learned the story from both sides." "Shut up," Bowen snapped, stepping forward. "Hands where I can see them." Whitmore sighed. as though tired of the conversation. Be careful, detective. The moment you decide who someone truly is, that's when you stop seeing them. That's what she did. Then he reached into his coat, not quickly, but deliberately, and tossed something onto the table. A folder. Inside was a typed confession, addressed to the Oregon State Attorney. Whitmore's signature gleamed at the bottom. Bowen blinked, unsure what game this was. "Why now?" he asked. Whitmore turned to Janet. "Because a teacher only completes his work when the student surpasses him." Without another word, he walked backward toward the doorway, disappearing into the dim corridor before Bowen could move. By the time the detective and Janet reached the stairs, the outer door was swaying open in the wind. He was gone. Outside, the night was heavy with rain. Police arrived within minutes, combing the grounds, but there was no trace, no footprints, no vehicle, nothing. It was as though he'd dissolved into the weather, just like the night Evelyn vanished. The confession proved real. Names, details, even precise accounts of the experiments. It reignited public outrage, but also confusion. Whitmore admitted to ethical violations, emotional manipulation, and concealment of evidence. But nowhere did he confess to murder. The line simply read, "Yem chose truth." Once again, Portland was left with questions instead of peace. For Bowen, it was the final fracture. He submitted his reports and retired quietly from the force 2 months later. Janet left Oregon soon after, determined to build a life beyond the reach of shadows. But sometimes, on stormy nights, she'd imagine the sound of a typewriter echoing faintly through the rain, steady, methodical, unending. Because somewhere out there, Harold Whitmore was still writing. And his next subject could be anyone who dared to look too closely. January 1970. The rain hadn't stopped in months. Portland was drowning in itself, swollen rivers, soaked rooftops, streets shimmering with neon reflection. The Marks investigation had faded from headlines, but its shadow lingered in every dark alley and dusty lecture hall. Those who remembered spoke of it quietly, as though conjuring Whitmore's name might summon him back. Detective Frank Bowen woke every morning before dawn, still calling himself detective, even though his badge had long since been surrendered. Retirement had brought neither peace nor distance. The professor haunted him, not Whitmore's crimes, but his calmness. The sense that, even in defeat, the man had been ahead of him. One gray morning, the mail arrived bound in wet string. Among the bills and flyers was a cream-colored package, no return label, faintly perfumed with mildew. Inside lay a single reel of magnetic tape and a brief note, handwritten in that same looping signature burned into Bowen's memory. Truth demands a second reading. H.W. Bowen hated how steady his own hand stayed as he loaded the reel into his recorder. The tape hissed, slow at first, then caught. The voice that filled the room was unmistakable. "Frank," Whitmore said, his tone conversational, almost friendly, "do you remember what you asked me that night?" "Why now?" "You believed I confessed for redemption, but it was only punctuation. You've been studying my syntax all along, detective. What if the final proof was never about Evelyn?" Bowen froze as faint background noise surfaced, rain tapping glass, a woman's sigh, and then words spoken faintly from somewhere behind the microphone. "Professor, should I start reading?" Janet Sinclair's voice. Soft. Controlled. The tape clicked off abruptly. Bowen stood for a full minute, unable to move. Janet had left the state, relocated to California under another name, far from Oregon's ghosts. But the tape was new. The brand hadn't existed until 1969. Somehow, Whitmore had found her. 3 days later, Bowen boarded a southbound train. The coast blurred past, mist swallowing coastline towns, endless waves battering the crumbling rocks. He arrived in San Francisco unannounced. Janet, now working as a journalist, opened her apartment door to find him standing there, soaked and wide-eyed. "Frank," she whispered, "you shouldn't be here." He handed her the tape. "Tell me you didn't record this." Her hands trembled as she examined the label. "I didn't," she said finally, "but I know where it was recorded." She led him downtown to a small writing collective, a space she occasionally used for freelance work. At the very back of the narrow brick building was a rented desk. On it sat a Remington typewriter identical to Whitmore's, ribbon fresh, a single page, half-typed inside. The words on that page froze Bowen where he stood. Portland, Oregon. The detective arrives at the writer's door. Beside the sheet lay another envelope, sealed with wax. Bowen tore open. Inside were 2 train tickets to Portland and a single photograph of the old Willamette campus at night. In the lower left corner, a faint dark shape stood beneath a lamppost. "He's calling us back," Bowen said. "He never left the city. He just waited for the weather to forget him." Janet took a shaky breath. "Then we answer." 2 days later, they returned to Portland. Rain greeted them once again, relentless, pounding against the train's windows like knuckles on wood. The university, now under new leadership, had become a fortress of locked doors and new security. No one talked about Whitmore anymore. Yet under the main courtyard arch, something fresh caught Bowen's eye, a bouquet of wilted flowers and a note pinned beneath it. "For Evelyn, whose truth endures." The handwriting was Whitmore's. That night, Bowen and Janet drove to the coast. Following a pattern of postmarks from the letters Whitmore once sent her, they traced his path westward, each station bringing them closer to the line between wilderness and sea. Finally, near Tillamook, they found it, a weather-beaten house atop a cliff, light flickering faintly through shuttered windows. They entered to the sound of the ocean's roar beneath the floorboards. Inside, the air was cold but not empty. Dust coated the furniture, yet the fire burned low in the hearth, recently stoked. Books lay open on every surface, pages marked, words circled, ideas annotated. And in the center of the living room stood a mirror, full length, draped in black cloth. Whitmore's voice came not from the man himself, but from a gramophone left near the fire. "Every investigator creates his subject," he said calmly. "Every subject creates his pursuer. 2 halves of the same thesis." Janet pulled back the cloth from the mirror before Bowen could stop her. Their reflections stared back, and behind them, faintly visible in the glass, stood a third silhouette, tall, unmoving, watching. When they turned, the room was empty. The record crackled again. "If you're seeing this," Whitmore's voice continued, "then you have accepted your role in the story. Detective, journalist, and the ghost that binds them. The story is no longer mine. Finish it well." The record ended, leaving the wind to fill the silence. They searched the house for hours. No one. No traces. Only pages and letters, fragments of Whitmore's unfinished manuscript, titled The Observation of Truth. Some pages were familiar, others completely new. At the bottom of the final sheet, typed neatly, was a single sentence. "The student watches, the teacher disappears." When they stepped outside, dawn was breaking. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, swallowing the horizon. Bowen paused at the cliff's edge, staring into the gray sea. "He's gone," Janet whispered behind him. "Maybe," Bowen said, eyes fixed on the waves. "Or maybe he's still writing." Neither spoke on the drive back to Portland. In the months that followed, the house was examined, catalogued, sealed. Officially, the case was closed again. There were no further letters, no new sightings. But every once in a while, when storms thickened and the city felt weighed down by memory, a single envelope would arrive at newspaper offices across Oregon, containing no threats, no gloating, just one phrase typed in elegant script. The story continues. February 1971. Portland was quiet again, but not peaceful. Decades later, people would call it the year the city forgot its voice. The Whitmore case had become the stuff of late-night debate, a ghost story wrapped in academia, a riddle that survived its author. The university had built a scholarship in Evelyn's name. Students touched the engraved plaque on their way to exams, some in reverence, others in fear. They said her story made them study harder, stay safer. They didn't talk about Whitmore anymore, but everyone felt him. Detective Frank Bowen had lost count of how many times he tried to write his report. His desk in the small apartment near Burnside was cluttered with coffee stains and half-burned cigarette butts. For years, he had hunted criminals who stole, cheated, and killed. But Harold Whitmore had stolen something else entirely: certainty. Bowen's notes, scattered across the desk, were full of crossed-out lines. Truth as a weapon. Truth as mirror. Truth as trap. He couldn't settle on a final line because he no longer believed there was a final line. He'd retired, but the city hadn't retired him. Reporters still found his number. They asked about Whitmore's last message, about the tapes, the essays, the letters that kept arriving, all unsigned but always typed in that same crisp rhythm. Every journalist swore the letters were distributed to different newsrooms, just pieces of a puzzle no one could solve. And then, one evening in March, Bowen received the phone call that pulled him back into the story. "Detective," a hesitant voice said. "It's about Miss Sinclair." Janet had been found near the Willamette River, barefoot, confused, trembling, but alive. Her clothes were soaked, her hands clenched around a notebook. The pages were blank except for the first one, which read, asterisk, "The teacher writes, the student remembers." Asterisk, missing for 3 days. She had no memory of how she'd gotten there. She simply said she followed the story. Bowen drove to St. Vincent's Hospital that night, rain smearing the windows as usual. Janet sat upright in bed, pale but alert, eyes heavy with exhaustion. The notebook rested on her lap. "I think he wanted me to finish it," she said, voice thin. "The last manuscript, it wasn't about Evelyn. It was about us." Bowen leaned closer. "What do you mean, us?" He studied control Frank. He proved he could manipulate confession, guilt, obsession. She paused, meeting his eyes. "You were his final subject. I was the observer." For a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. "I don't believe that," Bowen muttered. "You're just... think." She pointed at the notebook. "Who keeps sending the letters? Who knows when to make you move, what to show you next? He's been dead, gone, missing, whatever you want to call it, but you still listen when he speaks, don't you?" Bowen swallowed hard. If he's controlling the story from beyond the grave, then maybe we're just characters. Janet smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from understanding a terrible truth. Exactly. 2 weeks later, Portland's Oregonian published a final piece about the case. It wasn't written by Bowen or even by Janet, but by an anonymous contributor credited only as observer. It traced the events from Evelyn's disappearance in 1967 to Whitmore's vanishing near the coast. The final paragraph struck Portland silent for days. Every truth has a listener. Every story has its author. Every author, eventually, teaches the listener to write. Nobody claimed the article, but when Bowen read it aloud, he recognized the phrasing. It was Whitmore's cadence, his academic rhythm, the measured balance of intellect and arrogance. The byline was a message. That night, as wind pushed sheets of rain against his window, Bowen returned to his desk. The typewriter, a relic he'd kept from the police archives, sat waiting. He rolled in a fresh page and began to type, slow and careful, tracing every sound of the keys. But as he finished the first line, the words chilled him. Portland, Oregon. The detective sits alone, finishing the story. He hadn't thought those words. They had simply happened. He ripped the paper free, staring at the letters, breathing heavily. Then came a knock at the door, 3 steady, deliberate taps. He froze. Another knock. Louder. He rose, heart racing, and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Only the echo of rain against the metal door remained. But when he turned back to his desk, the typewriter was no longer silent. A single line had appeared on the page in fresh ink, though Bowen hadn't touched a key. Truth doesn't die with its maker. The carriage slid to the side and stopped. A small envelope sat beside it, one he was sure hadn't been there minutes ago. Inside, a photograph. It depicted the Willamette Library steps, soaked in rain, lit by the same lamp that had glowed the night Evelyn vanished. Only this time, a man stood at the bottom of the steps, his face half-shadowed, rain slicking his hair across his forehead. Bowen's breath caught. He knew that posture, that profile. It was him. The phone rang once, shrill and violent in the silence. When he picked up, static filled the line. Then came a single, faint whisper, unmistakable even through the distortion. "Detective," said Whitmore's voice, "it's your turn to write." The line went dead. He turned toward the typewriter again, trembling hand hovering above the keys. For a moment, he considered smashing it, ending everything. But then, somewhere deep within that old, stubborn instinct of curiosity, a darker urge pulsed, the same one that had driven him for years. The need to understand, to finish. He sat. The keys clicked once, and so began a new story. It opened the same way Whitmore's had before him. Portland, Oregon, a city of rain, secrets, and silence. Bowen whispered to no one, "Evelyn, I'll find the truth." The rain pressed harder against the windows. The typewriter's rhythm filled the room, steady, relentless, inhumanly smooth. When the paper was full, the machine kept typing.
For years, these cases were forgotten. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Here we reopen the files, reveal the evidence, and give a voice to those who were silenced. Subscribe now and step inside the archive where time, lies, and justice finally meet. Because every secret eventually speaks.